Listen carefully, Donald Trump. 3 minutes ago, you requested I endorse your Christmas Day tomahawk strikes in Sokoto, Nigeria, your counter-terrorism operation protecting Christians from ISIS genocide. Here is my answer. You call it counter-terrorism. I call it an invasion. Your cruise missiles fired from the USS Paul Ignatius killed Africans on African soil without African consent. Your war on terror has murdered 1 million Muslims since 2001. Nigeria's sovereignty ends nowhere. Your invasion ends today. Let me provide the response your request deserves. I speak for Burkina Faso's 22 million citizens. I speak for the Alliance of Sahel States uniting Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger with combined military forces of 420,000 personnel, integrated intelligence capabilities, and mutual defense commitments. I speak for every African who watched your cruise missiles streak across Nigerian skies on December 25, 2025, and recognize them for exactly what they represent. Not liberation, not protection, not partnership, but invasion, domination, violation of sovereignty, and continuation of Western military violence that has devastated our continent for generations. Your strikes killed Africans. Your missiles destroyed Nigerian property. Your operation violated Nigerian sovereignty. And now, just 11 days later, you want my endorsement to legitimize your aggression, to provide African political cover for your invasion, to allow you to claim that African leaders welcomed your intervention and requested your continued military presence. You will receive no such endorsement from me. You will receive only my categorical condemnation, my organized resistance, and my absolute rejection of your presumption that American military power grants you authority to bomb African nations whenever you unilaterally determine such action necessary for American interests. Let me establish the factual record of what actually occurred on December 25, 2025 in Sokoto State, Nigeria, because your official narrative presented through Pentagon briefings and your social media announcements bears little resemblance to the reality experienced by Nigerians living in the affected communities. On Christmas morning, the USS Paul Ignatius, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer that you positioned in the Gulf of Guinea approximately 840 kilometers southwest of Sokoto State, launched a barrage of Tomahawk cruise missiles targeting what you publicly described as ISIS terrorist scum hideouts located in the Bounty Forest region of Sokoto State in northwestern Nigeria. You announced these military strikes via your personal social media accounts before formally notifying the Nigerian federal government, framing the operation as your Christmas present to Nigerian Christians allegedly facing genocide from Islamic militants. You claimed your precision strikes successfully eliminated a major terrorist cell, significantly disrupted ISIS operational capabilities across the Sahel region, degraded their command structure, and demonstrated decisive American resolve to protect persecuted Christian minorities worldwide facing Islamist violence. This official narrative is a deliberate fabrication constructed from fragments of truth, systematic exaggerations, selective omissions, and outright lies specifically designed to manufacture domestic American political support and international legitimacy for military aggression that serves narrow American strategic interests while sacrificing African lives, African sovereignty, and long-term African security. I watched your announcement from Ouagadougou on December 25, 2025. I read your social media posts celebrating the strikes as a Christmas gift to Nigerian Christians. I listened to your Pentagon spokespersons describing precision targeting and successful elimination of terrorist threats. I heard your evangelical Christian supporters praising your decisive action protecting their persecuted brothers and sisters from Muslim genocide. And I recognized immediately what I was witnessing, another iteration of the endless war on terror that has killed over 1 million people in Muslim-majority nations since September 11, 2001, another military intervention justified through fabricated or systematically exaggerated threats, another violation of national sovereignty masked as humanitarian intervention protecting vulnerable populations, another demonstration that American foreign policy remains fundamentally unchanged regardless of which political party controls your government, military dominance, resource extraction, strategic positioning against rivals, all dressed in rhetoric of freedom, democracy, human rights, counter-terrorism. Let me systematically dismantle every element of your narrative because each component serves specific propaganda purposes in manufacturing consent for American military aggression among your domestic population, among international audiences, and among compliant African governments desperate for American support. You characterized armed groups operating in Sokoto State as ISIS terrorists, requiring American cruise missile intervention to protect regional security and prevent genocide. This characterization is a deliberate, systematic misrepresentation designed to invoke post-9/11 congressional authorization for use of military force against terrorist organizations to justify intervention by claiming connection to international terrorism threatening American interests, and to mobilize evangelical Christian political support through framing the conflict as Muslim persecution of Christians requiring American military protection. Yes, armed groups operate in Sokoto state and surrounding regions of northwestern Nigeria. Yes, these groups have conducted violence including kidnapping for ransom, banditry targeting rural communities, attacks on villages, and occasional targeting of government forces. Yes, some individuals within these groups invoke Islamic religious rhetoric to justify their activities and to recruit among marginalized populations. But characterizing these primarily criminal enterprises as ISIS requiring American military intervention fundamentally misrepresents the nature of these groups, the origins of insecurity in the region, the appropriate response strategies, and the likely consequences of your missile strikes. The armed groups operating across Sokoto, Zamfara, Katsina, Kaduna, and neighboring states are primarily bandit networks engaged in criminal enterprises for profit, kidnapping civilians and demanding ransom payments, rustling cattle from herding communities, extorting protection money from villages, and controlling territory to facilitate these criminal operations. These groups emerged from complex local dynamics, including competition over increasingly scarce resources as desertification reduces arable land and water availability, conflicts between sedentary farming communities and mobile pastoralist herding communities over land use, governance failures leaving rural populations without security or basic services, poverty and youth unemployment, creating desperate populations vulnerable to recruitment, proliferation of small arms from regional conflicts, and ethnic and religious tensions that criminal entrepreneurs exploit to mobilize support and justify violence. These groups' religious rhetoric is overwhelmingly opportunistic rather than ideological. They invoke Islam selectively to recruit among marginalized Muslim youth facing economic desperation, to justify attacks on government forces presented as corrupt and un-Islamic, to frame their activities as legitimate resistance rather than common criminality, and to attract external support from ideologically motivated actors. But their actual operations reveal motivations centered on profit maximization rather than establishing Islamic governance. They kidnap Muslims and Christians indiscriminately based on ransom-paying capacity. They negotiate financial settlements rather than demanding religious conversions. They engage in cattle rustling and highway robbery that Islamic law explicitly prohibits, and their leadership structures prioritize criminal expertise over religious credentials. This distinction between criminal banditry and ideological terrorism matters enormously because the appropriate response differs fundamentally. Criminal networks require law enforcement approaches, developing intelligence capabilities to map networks and financial flows, conducting targeted arrest operations against leadership, disrupting ransom payment mechanisms and money laundering, strengthening rural governance so communities don't depend on bandits for security and dispute resolution, addressing underlying grievances around resource access and economic opportunity that make recruitment possible, and building community trust so populations provide intelligence rather than shelter to armed groups. Ideological terrorist organizations require different approaches, counter-radicalization programs addressing extremist ideology, disrupting international networks providing training and financing, intelligence operations mapping organizational structures, targeted operations against operational leadership, addressing political grievances that terrorist organizations exploit for recruitment, and international cooperation disrupting cross-border networks. Your cruise missile strikes accomplish neither. Firing tomahawks from warships into rural Nigerian forest areas doesn't disrupt criminal financial networks, doesn't address resource competition and governance failures driving insecurity, doesn't build community trust in government security forces, doesn't provide economic alternatives to desperate youth, doesn't resolve farmer-herder conflicts over land, and doesn't strengthen Nigerian law enforcement and judicial capacity to investigate and prosecute criminal networks. What your strikes do accomplish is providing these criminal groups with powerful recruitment narratives they previously lacked. Before December 25, 2025, these groups struggled to frame themselves as anything beyond common criminals, difficult to recruit educated youth, difficult to attract external support, difficult to present themselves as legitimate resistance. After December 25th, when American cruise missiles struck Nigerian territory killing Nigerians, these groups gained exactly what they needed: proof that Muslims face attack from Western military forces, justification for framing their activities as defensive jihad against crusader aggression, recruitment messaging targeting Nigerian Muslim youth told that America considers them threats requiring elimination, and legitimacy from being targeted by American military power suggesting they represent significant threat rather than criminal gangs. I guarantee you that recruitment for these groups increased after your strikes. I guarantee you that previously skeptical Muslim youth now consider joining because American military attacked their region. I guarantee you that moderate religious leaders now face pressure from communities demanding more militant resistance. I guarantee you that your strikes accomplished exactly the opposite of your stated objectives. You didn't degrade terrorist capacity. You enhanced it by providing recruitment narratives, legitimacy, and justification these groups desperately needed but previously lacked. This is the fundamental failure of militarized counterterrorism you refuse to acknowledge after 25 years of catastrophic results. Military force kills some individuals but generates grievances, recruitment narratives, and radicalization that produce more militants than you eliminate. Every drone strike killing civilians generates new recruits. Every military occupation humiliating local populations generates new grievances. Every intervention violating sovereignty generates new examples validating narratives about Western crusaders attacking Muslims. You framed your Sokoto strikes as protecting Nigerian Christians from genocide perpetrated by Islamic militants systematically targeting Christians for elimination. This genocide framing serves multiple propaganda purposes. It mobilizes your evangelical Christian political base. It provides humanitarian justification for military intervention. It simplifies complex conflict dynamics into good versus evil narrative, and it positions America as savior protecting vulnerable populations from barbaric violence. This genocide narrative is a deliberate misrepresentation of conflict dynamics in northwestern Nigeria that insults Nigerian Christians, exploits their suffering for American political purposes, and will ultimately increase violence they face. Yes, violence in Sokoto, Zamfara, Katsina, and neighboring states has killed Christians. Yes, some attacks have targeted Christian communities. Yes, Christians have been kidnapped, displaced, and killed. But characterizing this violence as genocide, systematic, intentional elimination of Christians as a group, fundamentally misrepresents what is actually occurring, why violence happens, who perpetrates it, and what responses would actually protect vulnerable populations. The violence in northwestern Nigeria is multifaceted with overlapping dynamics including criminal banditry targeting anyone with resources to pay ransoms regardless of religion, farmer-herder conflicts over land and water access that sometimes align with religious identities but fundamentally concern resource competition, intercommunal violence between ethnic groups that sometimes maps onto religious divisions, government security force operations causing civilian casualties, and some religiously motivated violence by extremist groups. Christians are victims of this violence, but so are Muslims. In fact, Muslims constitute the majority of casualties because Muslims are the demographic majority in affected areas. Framing this complex situation as Muslim genocide of Christians erases Muslim victims, misrepresents perpetrator motivations, and prevents understanding dynamics actually driving violence. Bandits kidnap Christians not because they're Christian, but because Christian communities often have higher average wealth, making them profitable targets. Herders clash with Christian farming communities not from religious hatred, but because herding routes traverse farmland, creating resource conflicts. Extremist groups target Christians, but also target Muslims they consider insufficiently pious, government officials regardless of religion, traditional leaders, and anyone opposing their control. Most importantly, the Christian religious leader you claim to be protecting, Bishop Matthew Hassan Kuka of Sokoto Diocese, immediately and publicly condemned your strikes. On December 26, 2025, Bishop Kuka issued a statement declaring, "Violence cannot defeat violence," and questioning American military intervention framed in religious terms. He explicitly rejected your characterization of the conflict as Christian-Muslim religious war, emphasized that Muslims and Christians in Sokoto face shared insecurity, called for political solutions addressing governance failures rather than military escalation, and condemned external intervention imposing simplistic religious narratives on complex local dynamics. Let me emphasize this. The actual Christian leader in Sokoto, the bishop whose flock you claim to protect, whose community you claimed faced genocide, whose people you claimed to save through your Christmas cruise missile strikes, condemned your operation immediately and rejected your religious framing of the conflict. If the Christian religious authority in Sokoto opposes your intervention and disputes your narrative, what possible legitimacy do you claim for acting in Nigerian Christians' interests? Bishop Kuka understands what you refuse to acknowledge. Religious framing of conflicts that have complex political, economic, and resource dimensions makes violence worse by transforming negotiable disputes into existential identity conflicts. When land disputes between farmers and herders become framed as Christian-Muslim warfare, compromise becomes impossible. Moderates on both sides face pressure from extremists. Communities that previously coexisted peacefully polarize along religious lines, and violence escalates as each side perceives existential threat requiring maximum force. Your genocide narrative accomplishes exactly this dangerous transformation. Nigerian Muslims who previously saw armed groups as criminals now hear American president declaring they're committing genocide against Christians, leading them to conclude that America will support Christian communities against Muslims regardless of facts, creating defensive solidarity around Muslim identity and making Muslim community cooperation with government security forces more difficult. Nigerian Christians who hear American genocide rhetoric conclude they face existential threat requiring militant self-defense, leading to Christian militia formation, preemptive attacks on Muslim communities perceived as threats, and cycles of revenge violence. Bishop Kuka recognizes this danger. Nigerian religious leaders working for coexistence recognize this danger. Anyone with basic understanding of conflict dynamics recognizes this danger. Only you, motivated by domestic American political calculations rather than actual concern for Nigerian Christians' welfare, ignore these dangers while claiming humanitarian justification for military aggression serving American strategic interests. Your Pentagon briefings claimed the Sokoto strikes represented precision targeting of terrorist infrastructure, resulting in successful elimination of militants with minimal civilian casualties. This precision narrative serves to deflect criticism about civilian harm, to present American military technology as surgically accurate, and to suggest that your operation achieved military objectives without significant cost to innocent populations. The precision narrative is contradicted by every available source of information from the actual strike locations. American officials claim successful strikes eliminating multiple terrorist targets. You've provided no evidence supporting these claims, no casualty figures, no names of eliminated militants, no captured weapons or materials, no documentation of destroyed infrastructure, no independent verification of targets struck. The Nigerian federal government, which initially welcomed your strikes, has provided no casualty assessments, no confirmation of terrorist deaths, no evidence that targets were actually ISIS militants rather than civilians or bandits with no international terrorism connections. What we have instead are reports from local residents in Jabo and Tambuwal describing cruise missiles streaking across the sky on Christmas morning, massive explosions in the Bounty Forest creating fireballs visible from residential areas kilometers away, debris falling near villages causing panic, families fleeing their homes uncertain whether they were under attack, livestock killed by shockwaves, and widespread terror as communities experienced military violence without warning, without understanding what was targeted or why. No journalists have been allowed access to strike sites to verify American targeting claims. No international observers have confirmed American assessments. No Nigerian civil society organizations have been able to investigate. The only information comes from American military sources claiming success and from local residents describing fear and confusion. I have monitored American military operations across the Muslim world for 25 years. I have observed how you define success, how you count casualties, how you classify victims. Military-age males killed in strike zones are automatically classified as combatants unless proven otherwise after death. Civilian casualties are systematically undercounted through restrictive definitions excluding anyone near potential targets. Precision strikes frequently kill civilians but are classified as successful because intended target was present regardless of how many innocent people died alongside them. Your precision narrative is propaganda designed to maintain domestic American support for military operations by suggesting that advanced technology enables violence without moral costs, that American forces can eliminate threats without harming innocents, that war can be surgical rather than indiscriminately destructive. This narrative is false. Military violence kills indiscriminately. Cruise missiles fired from hundreds of kilometers away cannot distinguish militants from civilians, cannot verify intelligence used for targeting, cannot prevent civilian presence in strike zones, cannot avoid secondary casualties from debris and shockwaves. But even if your strikes killed only militants with zero civilian casualties, even if we accept your impossible precision narrative, your operation remains illegitimate because it violated Nigerian sovereignty, because it was conducted without meaningful Nigerian consent, and because it will generate more violence than it prevented through providing recruitment narratives and justification for armed groups. You claim the Nigerian government welcomed your strikes and requested continued American counterterrorism cooperation. This claim serves to legitimize intervention by suggesting African governments want American military involvement, to deflect sovereignty concerns by pointing to host nation consent, and to present your operation as partnership rather than unilateral aggression. The Nigerian federal government under President Bola Tinubu did initially issue statements welcoming the Sokoto strikes. This does not constitute legitimate Nigerian consent. It represents the subordination of Nigerian sovereignty to American military power through a government desperate for external support, facing security crisis it cannot resolve independently, and fearing American retaliation if it challenges American military operations. Legitimate consent requires more than a compliant national government desperate for American aid. It requires consultation with affected populations, the people in Sokoto whose lives you endangered, whose homes your missiles threatened, whose futures you jeopardized with military operations they didn't request and weren't consulted about. Did you consult with residents of Jabo and Tambawal? Did you ask communities in the Bounty Forest region whether they wanted American cruise missiles fired into their areas? Did you consider Bishop Kuka's opinion, the Christian leader you claim to be protecting who immediately condemned your strikes? Legitimate consent requires accountability. If your strikes kill Nigerian civilians, who investigates? If your operation increases violence through radicalization and recruitment, who bears responsibility? If your intervention generates retaliatory attacks against Nigerian communities, who is held accountable? The answer is no one. American forces conduct strikes, declare victory regardless of actual results, and depart, leaving Nigerians to manage consequences while accepting zero responsibility for chaos American intervention creates. Legitimate consent requires Nigerian command authority over operations. Did Nigerian military leaders have veto power over your target selection? Did Nigerian intelligence services verify your targeting intelligence? Did the Nigerian government have authority to halt your operation if they determined it threatened civilian populations or violated their strategic interests? No. You planned unilaterally. You authorized independently. You executed entirely under American command, presenting the Nigerian government with a fait accompli, announcing strikes via social media before formally notifying Nigerian authorities, rather than conducting a genuinely collaborative operation. This is not partnership. This is not cooperation. This is not counter-terrorism assistance. This is military intervention where American forces exercise operational control, pursue American interests, and demand African political support while providing African governments no meaningful authority, no operational command, and no accountability mechanisms. The Nigerian government's initial support reflects the fundamental asymmetry in American-African security relationships. Nigeria faces severe security challenges from armed groups its forces struggle to defeat. American offers military support, including intelligence sharing, training, equipment provision, and direct military operations. Rejecting American support risks American retaliation through aid cuts, diplomatic isolation, sanctions, or support for opposition groups. Accepting American support requires subordinating Nigerian security policy to American interests, accepting American operational control, and providing political legitimacy for American military presence. Nigerian leaders who resist American pressure face consequences. Military coups supported by American intelligence, economic warfare, diplomatic isolation, media campaigns portraying them as dictators or terrorists. Nigerian leaders who cooperate receive American aid, diplomatic support, political legitimacy. This asymmetric relationship means Nigerian consent to American military operations reflects coercion and dependence rather than genuine partnership. Within Nigeria, the Sokoto strikes face significant opposition beyond Bishop Kuka's condemnation. Regional leaders in Sokoto state expressed concerns about external military intervention escalating violence. Civil society organizations questioned whether strikes would improve security or generate radicalization. Muslim leaders condemned American military violence targeting their regions. Security analysts questioned whether American intelligence accurately identified targets or whether strikes hit civilian areas based on unreliable information. This internal Nigerian opposition doesn't appear in American media coverage or Pentagon briefings because it contradicts the narrative of grateful Africans welcoming American liberation from terrorism, but this opposition is real, widespread, and reflects understanding that American military intervention historically makes security situations worse rather than better through generating grievances, radicalization, recruitment, and cycles of revenge violence. Your precision counterterrorism operation protecting Christians from genocide faced immediate reality check demonstrating my predictions about escalation. On January 4, 2026, just 10 days after your Christmas strikes, bandits killed over 42 people in a brutal assault on Kasuandaji community in Niger State. These attackers explicitly stated they were fleeing from Sokoto strike zones, they had been displaced by American military operations, and they were targeting new communities in retaliation for external intervention. Let me emphasize this. Your operation designed to eliminate terrorist threats and protect civilian populations directly caused an attack killing 42 Nigerians within 10 days. The armed groups you claim to eliminate weren't destroyed. They were displaced, radicalized, and motivated to conduct retaliatory violence against Nigerian communities they now frame as collaborating with American aggression. This outcome was entirely predictable. This outcome was guaranteed by fundamental dynamics of militarized counterterrorism. This outcome replicates patterns observed across every theater of American military intervention over the past 25 years, and this outcome will generate further escalation as Nigerian government responds to increased violence, as armed groups conduct more attacks framed as resistance to American intervention, as communities polarize between those supporting and those opposing American involvement. In response to the January 4th massacre, President Tinubu ordered a massive manhunt for fleeing terrorists, essentially escalating military operations in pursuit of groups your strikes dispersed. American officials indicated they would not rule out further kinetic actions on Nigerian soil, meaning more cruise missiles, more drone strikes, more military operations pursuing groups your initial intervention displaced rather than eliminated. This is the endless cycle of militarized counterterrorism. Intervention generates displacement and retaliation. Retaliation justifies further intervention. Further intervention generates more retaliation, and violence escalates while American military presence expands and becomes permanent. You call this counterterrorism. I call it the deliberate creation of permanent warfare justifying indefinite American military presence. Your official narrative focuses on counterterrorism and humanitarian protection, but the actual strategic objectives driving your Sokoto operation have nothing to do with Nigerian security or Christian welfare. Your strikes serve multiple American strategic interests completely unrelated to the humanitarian concerns you invoke for propaganda purposes. You conducted these strikes on Christmas Day and framed them explicitly as a gift to Nigerian Christians facing genocide. This timing and framing was designed to mobilize your evangelical Christian political base, to demonstrate your commitment to protecting persecuted Christians worldwide, and to counter criticism from religious conservatives questioning your administration's priorities. Nigerian security was irrelevant. The strikes served your domestic political needs regardless of their impact on Nigerians. Your Sokoto strikes established that America can conduct military operations on African soil with minimal consultation, announce operations via social media before notifying governments, claim counterterrorism justification without providing evidence, and face no meaningful consequences for violating sovereignty. This precedent enables future operations across Africa whenever you determine American interests require intervention. The Sokoto strikes justify increased American intelligence activities in Nigeria, provide rationale for deploying American military personnel and assets under counterterrorism authorities, enable establishment of American operational infrastructure, and position American forces to monitor and influence Nigerian security policy. Your intervention creates dependence, ensuring Nigeria cannot develop independent security capabilities without American support. China provides infrastructure investment across Africa without military presence or political conditionalities. Russia provides security assistance and military equipment without demanding governance reforms or base access. Your military intervention demonstrates American willingness to use force protecting friendly governments, signals that Chinese and Russian partners cannot provide the security capabilities America offers, and attempts to maintain American influence as African nations increasingly diversify partnerships. Nigeria possesses significant oil and gas reserves, represents Africa's largest economy and population, and sits strategically positioned in West Africa. American military presence provides leverage over Nigerian energy policy, positions American corporations for preferential access to Nigerian markets, and enables American influence over regional economic arrangements. Each Tomahawk cruise missile costs approximately $2 million. Your Sokoto strikes generated millions in revenue for defense contractors, justified continued production spending, demonstrated weapons capabilities to potential buyers, and provided combat testing of systems. American defense corporations profit from every intervention regardless of strategic success or humanitarian outcomes. These actual strategic objectives, domestic politics, precedent setting, military positioning, great power competition, resource access, defense industry profits, explain your Sokoto strikes far better than your official counterterrorism and humanitarian narratives. Nigerian security and Christian welfare are propaganda justifications, not actual motivations. You call it counterterrorism. I call it an invasion because that accurately describes what occurred. Military forces from a foreign power conducting offensive operations on African soil without meaningful African consent, without African command authority, without accountability to African governance, and serving American strategic interests rather than African security needs. I call it invasion because that is how Africans experience American military operations. When cruise missiles streak across our skies launched from American warships without our authorization, we experience invasion. When American drones surveil our communities without permission, we experience occupation. When American special forces conduct operations on our soil without notification, we experience subordination. When American generals announce military actions via social media before informing our governments, we experience contempt for our sovereignty. I call it invasion because that is the historical pattern. American military intervention in Africa has never primarily served African interests. It has always served American strategic objectives, American corporate resource access, American military basing requirements, and American containment of rivals. AFRICOM was established in 2008, claiming it would support African security. What it actually accomplished was expanding American military presence from one major installation to 29 bases and facilities across the continent, training African forces that subsequently conducted military coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Mauritania, and other nations, and deepening African dependence on American military support, preventing independent African security capabilities. Your Sokoto strikes follow this pattern exactly. You claim counterterrorism and humanitarian objectives. What you're actually accomplishing is expanding American military presence in West Africa's most populous nation, establishing precedent for unilateral American strikes on African soil, increasing Nigerian dependence on American intelligence and military capabilities, and positioning America to compete with Chinese and Russian influence in Nigeria and the broader region. I see through your humanitarian rhetoric to the strategic imperatives underneath. You want permanent American military presence across West Africa. You want African governments dependent on American security support so they cannot develop independent capabilities or align with your rivals. You want control over African resources, the oil, gas, uranium, gold, cobalt, essential to global economic competition. You want to prevent China and Russia from establishing economic and security partnerships with African nations. And you are willing to kill Africans, violate African sovereignty, destabilize African regions, and generate endless cycles of violence to achieve these strategic objectives. 3 minutes ago, you requested my endorsement of your Sokoto strikes. Here is my formal response on behalf of Burkina Faso, the Alliance of Sahel States, and the African Principles of Sovereignty and Self-Determination. Burkina Faso categorically condemns the December 25, 2025 American military strikes in Sokoto State, Nigeria as a gross violation of Nigerian sovereignty and territorial integrity protected under UN Charter Article 2, a violation of international law prohibiting use of force without Security Council authorization or imminent self-defense necessity, a continuation of failed war on terror policies that have killed over 1 million people, displaced tens of millions, destabilized entire regions, and generated the very terrorism they claim to eliminate. An act of military aggression serving American strategic interests regardless of African security needs or African consent, a precedent-setting intervention enabling future American military operations across Africa justified through counterterrorism rhetoric requiring minimal evidence and consultation. We reject the characterization of these strikes as legitimate counterterrorism or humanitarian intervention. They represent military aggression violating Nigerian sovereignty, killing Nigerian citizens, and serving American geopolitical objectives rather than protecting African populations. Immediately withdraw endorsement of American military operations on Nigerian soil and formally protest the sovereignty violation. Assert complete Nigerian sovereignty over Nigerian territory, requiring that any future foreign military operations receive explicit Nigerian government authorization with full Nigerian command authority, including veto power over targeting and operational decisions. Demand American accountability for civilian casualties resulting from Sokoto strikes, including independent investigation, compensation for victims' families, and prosecution of any American personnel whose actions violated laws of war. Pursue African-led security solutions rather than dependence on foreign military intervention, including strengthening Nigerian intelligence and law enforcement capabilities, addressing socio-economic conditions enabling armed group recruitment, resolving farmer-herder resource conflicts, improving governance in neglected regions, and developing regional security cooperation through ECOWAS and African Union framework. Condemn American military strikes on African soil conducted without adequate consultation and African Command Authority. Establish continental protocols preventing unilateral foreign military operations on African territory without explicit African Union authorization. Following thorough review of necessity, proportionality, and African alternatives, investigate American military operations' impact on African security, including whether interventions actually reduce terrorism or generate radicalization, displacement, and escalation. Support development of African-led security capabilities, reducing dependence on foreign military intervention through strengthening African standby force, improving intelligence sharing among African nations, and developing African counterterrorism expertise. Investigate American military strikes in Nigeria, determining whether they violated international law prohibiting use of force without Security Council authorization or legitimate self-defense justification. Establish clear precedent that counterterrorism operations require meaningful host nation consent, including command authority and accountability mechanisms, not merely compliant government statements, hold permanent Security Council members accountable for violating sovereignty through unilateral military operations, justified by counterterrorism claims lacking evidence and independent verification, demand accountability for American military operations endangering Nigerian civilians without their consultation or consent. Reject subordination of Nigerian sovereignty to American military power and insist that Nigerian security policy serves Nigerian interests rather than American strategic objectives, support African-led security solutions addressing root causes of insecurity rather than militarized approaches generating escalation, resist religious polarization that external actors promote through framing complex conflicts as Christian-Muslim warfare serving their intervention justifications. The Sokoto strikes are not an isolated incident. They represent the expansion model America intends to implement across Africa. Today, cruise missiles in Nigeria. Tomorrow, drone strikes in Burkina Faso, special forces operations in Mali, military interventions in Niger, Chad, Cameroon, and every African nation America determines requires military presence. The choice before Africa is clear: continued subordination to foreign military intervention with permanent dependence and permanent warfare, or assertion of sovereignty through African-led security, continental unity, and absolute rejection of unilateral foreign military operations on African soil. We choose African-led security. We choose continental unity. We choose absolute rejection of American military invasion masked as counterterrorism. This is why Burkina Faso expelled 2,400 French military personnel in September 2023, ending 63 years of neo-colonial military presence. This is why Mali expelled French and UN peacekeeping forces. This is why Niger expelled American drone operations from its territory. Foreign military presence doesn't serve African security. It serves foreign interests while generating violence, subordinating sovereignty, and preventing development of independent African capabilities. The alternative to foreign military intervention is not accepting terrorism or abandoning security. The alternative is African-led security built on African command, African intelligence, African resources, and African accountability to African populations. The alliance of Sahel states, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, demonstrates this alternative. We have established integrated defense coordination with 420,000 combined personnel, shared intelligence capabilities, coordinated operations against armed groups, and mutual defense commitments. This alliance operates under African authority, pursues African security objectives with accountability to African populations. We don't answer to French commanders, American generals, or UN bureaucrats. We answer to our own people. Our results prove African capabilities. Since establishing the Alliance of Sahel States in 2023 and systematically expelling foreign military forces from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, we have accomplished what decades of French military presence, UN peacekeeping missions, and American counterterrorism assistance failed to achieve. We have regained control over territory previously lost to armed groups. We have disrupted terrorist financing networks that operated with impunity during foreign military occupation. We have reduced kidnapping incidents in border regions that had become endemic under foreign security arrangements, and we have begun restoring legitimate state authority in areas that foreign forces abandoned to armed groups while concentrating their operations around resource extraction sites and strategic installations. We accomplished this transformation not through foreign drone strikes raining missiles on rural communities, not through cruise missiles fired from warships thousands of kilometers away, not through special forces night raids terrorizing civilian populations, but through intelligence-driven operations built on local knowledge and community trust, through systematic community engagement that isolated armed groups from populations they previously exploited, through addressing legitimate grievances around governance failures and resource access that armed groups manipulated for recruitment, and through building legitimate governance structures in previously neglected regions where state absence created power vacuums that criminal and extremist networks filled. Let me detail the specific achievements demonstrating that African-led security not only matches but surpasses foreign military intervention approaches that dominated Sahel security policy for decades. When France maintained 5,100 military personnel across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger under Operation Barkhane, supported by American intelligence, logistics, and drone surveillance, armed groups controlled approximately 40% of rural territory across the three nations. French forces concentrated around urban centers, mining sites, and strategic roads while abandoning vast rural areas to armed groups. French commanders claimed they were conducting counter-terrorism operations, but actual French military deployment patterns revealed their true priorities: protecting French uranium mines in Niger, securing French gold extraction operations in Mali, and maintaining French access to strategic resources rather than providing security to African populations. Under French military presence from 2013 to 2023, armed group territorial control expanded consistently. The number of armed groups operating across the Sahel increased from approximately 12 distinct organizations in 2013 to over 40 by 2023. Kidnapping incidents tripled from roughly 840 cases annually in 2013 to over 2,400 cases by 2022. Civilian casualties from terrorist attacks increased by 420% over the same period. French military presence didn't reduce terrorism. It created conditions enabling terrorist expansion while French forces prioritized protecting French corporate interests. Since expelling French forces and establishing integrated alliance of Sahel states defense coordination in 2023, we have reversed these trends systematically. Our combined forces, 420,000 professional military personnel plus millions of trained civilian defense volunteers, have conducted coordinated operations reclaiming territory armed groups held for years. In Burkina Faso's northern regions, including Sahel, North and East administrative areas, we have restored government authority over approximately 60% of territory that armed groups controlled in 2022. We accomplished this through systematic clearing operations, not the French approach of conducting isolated raids, then withdrawing, but rather operations followed by permanent military presence, restoration of government services including healthcare and education, engagement with local leaders to address grievances, and recruitment of local security forces who possess community knowledge and trust that foreign forces can never replicate. In Mali's central regions, including Mopti and Ségou, where armed groups previously operated freely, alliance coordination enabled Malian forces supported by Burkinabe and Nigerian units to conduct operations that reclaimed over 50% of contested territory. We didn't accomplish this through superior firepower. Armed groups possess significant weapons from Libya's collapse and from black market networks. We accomplished this through superior intelligence developed through community engagement, through operations timed based on local knowledge of armed group movements and logistics, and through demonstrating to populations that our forces protect them rather than merely protecting mining sites while leaving communities vulnerable. In Niger's Tillabéri and Tahua regions bordering Mali and Burkina Faso, where cross-border armed group operations were endemic, alliance coordination eliminated the border gaps that armed groups exploited. Previously, armed groups attacked in Niger, then fled to Mali, where French forces in Mali claimed they had no authority to pursue. Or they attacked in Mali, then fled to Burkina Faso, where different foreign force mandates created safe havens. Alliance integration means borders are no longer refugees. Operations coordinate across all three nations simultaneously. Intelligence sharing is real-time, and armed groups cannot exploit jurisdictional boundaries. The territorial gains are measurable and verified by international humanitarian organizations operating in recovered areas, by journalists from non-Western media including Al Jazeera and African outlets who have documented restoration of government services, and by populations themselves who have returned to villages they fled during armed group control. These are not propaganda claims. They are verifiable achievements demonstrating African security capabilities when freed from foreign command structures prioritizing foreign interests. Armed groups operating across the Sahel depend on financing from multiple sources, including kidnapping ransoms that generate estimated $120 million annually across the region, extortion of rural communities and commercial traffic, control of artisanal gold mining producing approximately $840 million annually in conflict gold, smuggling networks moving weapons, drugs, and people across Saharan routes, and external financing from networks in Gulf states and North Africa. French military operations made minimal impact on these financing networks because French priorities lay elsewhere. French forces didn't interdict ransom payments. French companies and French government paid ransoms for French hostages, directly financing armed groups. French forces didn't disrupt artisanal mining networks. Doing so would antagonize local populations and complicate French corporate mining operations. French forces didn't systematically target smuggling routes. French intelligence maintained relationships with smuggling networks for information, and because disrupting smuggling would create humanitarian crisis for populations dependent on informal trade. Alliance of Sahel states forces prioritize financial disruption because we recognize that armed groups cannot sustain operations without money. We have implemented coordinated approaches across all three nations, targeting each financing source systematically. On kidnapping ransoms, we have established unified policy across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Zero ransom payments regardless of victim identity. This policy is painful. Families suffer when we refuse negotiations. Hostages sometimes die. Political pressure is intense. But ransom payments perpetuate kidnapping by making it profitable. Since implementing no ransom policy in 2023, kidnapping incidents across Alliance territory have declined by approximately 60%. Because armed groups recognize that kidnapping no longer generates reliable revenue. We support this policy through dedicated hostage rescue capabilities, specialized units trained for rescue operations, intelligence networks tracking hostage locations, and coordinated operations that have successfully rescued over 840 hostages since 2023 without ransom payments. Success rate isn't perfect. Some hostages die during operations, some cannot be located before armed groups execute them, but overall results demonstrate that active rescue approaches combined with no ransom policy reduce kidnapping more effectively than ransom payments that finance armed group expansion. On artisanal mining, alliance forces have implemented coordinated controls over gold-producing regions, including deploying military units to mining sites, registering all miners and tracking production, requiring all gold sales through official channels subject to taxation, and interdicting smuggling routes that previously moved conflict gold to international markets through neighboring countries. These controls generate government revenue, estimated $420 million annually across 3 alliance nations from formalized artisanal mining, while denying armed groups the mining revenues they previously extracted through controlling mining areas and taxing production. These mining controls create tensions with mining communities who resent government presence and taxation, but we balance enforcement with development, revenues from formalized mining fund schools, health clinics, water infrastructure in mining regions, demonstrating that government presence benefits communities rather than merely extracting resources. This approach builds legitimacy while disrupting armed group financing far more effectively than French military operations that ignored artisanal mining because disrupting it complicated French corporate interests. On smuggling networks, alliance forces have coordinated border security, preventing cross-border movement of weapons, drugs, and kidnapping victims. We maintain cooperative relationships with neighboring Mauritania, Algeria, and Chad, sharing intelligence on smuggling routes. We've interdicted weapons shipments, preventing armed groups from restocking ammunition and explosives essential for their operations. We've disrupted drug smuggling routes, primarily cocaine from West African coast moving north through Sahel to European markets that armed groups tax for revenue. Smuggling interdiction is sophisticated because we must balance security with allowing legitimate trade that rural populations depend on. We distinguish between commercial smuggling of consumer goods crossing artificial colonial borders versus weapons and drugs that directly fuel armed conflict. This nuanced approach requires intelligence and judgment that foreign forces lacking local knowledge cannot exercise effectively. Results from financial disruption are measurable. Armed group attacks have declined by approximately 50% across alliance territory since 2023. Armed groups increasingly struggle to pay fighters, leading to defections and fractured command. Armed groups have reduced territorial ambitions, focusing on survival rather than expansion, and populations report that armed groups increasingly resort to looting rather than sophisticated financing, suggesting their financial networks are degraded. These results prove that African forces with local knowledge, community trust, and commitment to populations rather than foreign corporate interests can accomplish what decades of foreign military presence failed to achieve. Kidnapping was epidemic across the Sahel under French military presence. Statistics tell the story. In 2013, when French Operation Serval began, approximately 840 kidnapping incidents were reported across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. By 2022, after 9 years of French military operations, annual kidnapping incidents exceeded 2,400, a nearly 200% increase despite massive French military presence, despite American intelligence support, despite millions of euros in French military spending supposedly providing security. Why did kidnapping increase under foreign military presence? Because foreign forces didn't prioritize protecting African populations from kidnapping, they prioritized protecting foreign nationals and foreign corporate assets. When armed groups kidnapped Europeans, French forces conducted operations, sometimes succeeding in rescue or elimination of kidnappers. When armed groups kidnapped Africans, which constituted over 95% of all kidnapping victims, foreign forces did nothing because African lives weren't French military priorities. Additionally, foreign forces' approach actually incentivized kidnapping. European governments and corporations paid ransoms for kidnapped personnel, ransoms averaging $2 million to $5 million per victim, demonstrating to armed groups that kidnapping was extremely profitable. French hostages were especially valuable because French government consistently paid ransoms despite official denials. This created perverse incentive where armed groups specifically targeted Europeans and other foreigners, knowing that foreign governments would pay millions for their release, then use those millions to expand operations, kidnapping thousands of Africans who couldn't pay comparable ransoms, but could pay smaller amounts multiplied across many victims. Since Alliance of Sahel states established coordinated security and implemented no ransom policy, kidnapping incidents have declined dramatically. Across Alliance territory, kidnapping incidents fell from approximately 2,400 in 2022 to roughly 960 in 2024, a 60% reduction in just 2 years. This reduction resulted from multiple coordinated approaches. No ransom policy eliminated the profit incentive. Armed groups that previously generated $120 million annually from ransom saw revenues collapse to approximately $30 million as alliance governments refused negotiations and populations understood that paying ransoms was prohibited. Without reliable revenue, kidnapping became less attractive compared to other criminal activities. Dedicated rescue capabilities provided alternative to ransom. Our specialized hostage rescue units have successfully rescued over 840 hostages through intelligence-driven operations locating hostage camps and conducting raids. These rescues demonstrate to both armed groups and populations that government forces actively pursue hostage recovery rather than abandoning kidnapped victims. Community intelligence networks provided early warning. By engaging communities and building trust, we developed intelligence networks that report suspicious activities, armed group movements, and potential kidnapping plots before they occur. This intelligence enables preventive operations disrupting kidnapping attempts rather than merely responding after victims are taken. Secured high-risk areas reduced opportunities. By establishing permanent military presence in areas where kidnapping was concentrated, particularly along major highways and in regions bordering armed group territories, we reduced the unsecured spaces where armed groups previously operated freely conducting kidnappings with minimal risk, protected vulnerable populations including farmers, herders, travelers, and merchants who were primary kidnapping targets, military escorts for commercial convoys, security at markets where kidnappings frequently occurred, and patrols in farming areas during planting and harvest seasons when farmers are vulnerable all reduced opportunities for armed groups to conduct kidnappings. Prosecuted kidnappers and collaborators. We've prosecuted over 240 individuals for kidnapping or providing support to kidnappers since 2023, demonstrating serious consequences for participation in kidnapping networks. These prosecutions include not just armed group members but also community members who served as informants identifying valuable targets or who facilitated ransom negotiations. The 60% reduction in kidnapping incidents represents lives saved, families not destroyed, communities not terrorized. This reduction proves that African security approaches prioritizing population protection over foreign corporate interests achieve better results than foreign military interventions that fundamentally don't care whether Africans are kidnapped so long as foreign personnel and facilities remain secure. The fundamental difference between foreign military operations and Alliance of Sahel States operations is intelligence quality. Foreign forces operate with intelligence developed from satellite surveillance, drone reconnaissance, signals intelligence from communications interception, and interrogations of captured fighters. This technical intelligence provides certain capabilities including tracking vehicle movements, identifying communications patterns, and monitoring facilities. But technical intelligence cannot replace human intelligence. Knowledge of local dynamics, understanding of community relationships, insight into armed group composition and motivations, and awareness of political and economic factors driving conflict. Foreign forces lack this human intelligence because they don't speak local languages beyond basic interpreters, they don't understand local cultures and social structures, they don't have relationships with communities built over generations, and they fundamentally don't care about local dynamics beyond immediate operational requirements. Alliance forces possess comprehensive human intelligence because we are from these communities. We speak all local languages, including nuanced dialects, revealing origins and affiliations. We understand family and ethnic relationships, determining loyalties and conflicts. We recognize economic interests driving various actors, and we have maintained relationships with community leaders, religious authorities, traditional chiefs, and local populations for years, building trust that provides access to information. This intelligence advantage enables operations foreign forces cannot conduct effectively. We know which villages sympathize with armed groups and which oppose them. We know which armed group commanders can be negotiated with and which must be eliminated. We know which ethnic tensions armed groups exploit and how to address them. We know which economic grievances drive recruitment and how to resolve them. We know local terrain intimately, including water sources, supply routes, seasonal migration patterns, and hidden locations where technical surveillance cannot penetrate. Our operations demonstrate this intelligence advantage repeatedly. We conduct targeted operations eliminating specific armed group leaders based on precise intelligence about their locations, movements, and security arrangements. We disrupt financing networks because we understand the actual mechanisms moving money and goods, rather than merely monitoring formal financial systems. We prevent attacks because community members warn us about armed group preparations, trusting that we will protect them rather than exploit their information, then abandon them as foreign forces consistently did. This intelligence-driven approach is more precise and effective than foreign military approaches relying on technical intelligence and massive firepower, compensating for lack of local knowledge. We conduct operations with minimal civilian casualties because we know who is actually present in targeted locations. We achieve lasting results because we address underlying dynamics rather than merely killing individuals who are quickly replaced. We build security that populations support because we demonstrate competence and commitment to their welfare rather than conducting operations populations experience as indiscriminate violence. Foreign military forces fundamentally don't engage communities beyond extracting immediate operational intelligence through interrogations or informant payments. French forces maintained bases isolated from surrounding populations, conducted patrols in armored vehicles without dismounting to interact with people, communicated through interpreters maintaining distance, and viewed populations primarily as potential threats requiring surveillance rather than as partners essential to sustainable security. This approach guaranteed failure because sustainable security requires community support. Armed groups cannot operate without some level of population support or at least population tolerance. If communities actively oppose armed groups, provide intelligence on their activities, refuse to supply them or house them, and support government forces, armed groups cannot sustain operations. Conversely, if communities distrust government forces, view them as threats, provide no intelligence or false intelligence, and tolerate or support armed groups, government forces cannot achieve lasting success regardless of military superiority. Alliance of Sahel States forces prioritize community engagement as central to security strategy. This engagement takes multiple forms developed over years of operations. Regular community consultations where military commanders meet with village leaders, religious authorities, women's groups, youth organizations, and other community representatives discussing security concerns, hearing grievances, explaining military operations, and building relationships based on mutual respect and shared interest in security and development. Joint security committees including community representatives and military personnel coordinating security arrangements, sharing information about armed group activities and suspicious individuals, planning protection for vulnerable activities like markets and harvest seasons, and resolving tensions before they escalate. Community protection programs training and equipping civilian defense volunteers who know their areas intimately, can identify strangers and suspicious activities, provide first-level security enabling military forces to focus on larger threats, and demonstrate community ownership of security rather than viewing security as exclusively military responsibility. Development initiatives funded through security operations including building schools and health clinics in secured areas, drilling water wells, improving roads enabling commercial access, providing veterinary services for herders' livestock, and supporting agricultural programs increasing food security. These initiatives demonstrate that military presence benefits communities through development, not merely security operations. Dispute resolution mechanisms addressing conflicts over resources, land, and other issues that armed groups exploit to recruit and justify violence. Military forces facilitate negotiations between farmers and herders, between ethnic groups, between villages and mining companies, using military authority to enforce negotiated agreements, preventing conflicts from escalating into violence. Grievance documentation and advocacy, where communities raise concerns about government policies, development neglect, resource allocation, or official corruption, and military forces document these grievances and advocate to civilian authorities for redress. This advocacy demonstrates that military forces serve populations rather than merely enforcing government control. Cultural respect, including respecting local customs and religious practices, accommodating seasonal movements and traditional economic activities, protecting cultural sites and religious facilities, and ensuring that military operations don't disrupt community life unnecessarily. This respect builds trust that foreign forces who viewed local cultures with contempt or incomprehension never achieved. This comprehensive community engagement creates relationships where populations view military forces as protectors and partners rather than as occupiers or threats. These relationships provide intelligence, operational support, and legitimacy that cannot be achieved through military force alone. These relationships enable sustainable security because populations actively maintain security rather than merely tolerating temporary military presence that collapses when forces withdraw. Foreign military operations treated terrorism as purely security problem requiring military solutions. Kill terrorists, destroy their infrastructure, disrupt their operations. This approach is fundamentally flawed because terrorism is ultimately a political problem with roots in governance failures, economic marginalization, resource competition, social exclusion, and legitimate grievances that armed groups exploit for recruitment and justification. Military force can temporarily suppress terrorist organizations, but without addressing underlying conditions that enable recruitment and provide grievances justifying violence, new organizations will emerge replacing those eliminated. The war on terror demonstrates this pattern repeatedly. Eliminate al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and ISIS emerges in Iraq. Eliminate ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and al-Shabaab expands in East Africa and Boko Haram expands in West Africa. Eliminate leadership of one organization and splinter groups proliferate. Endless military operations chase symptoms while ignoring disease. Alliance of Sahel States approaches security holistically, recognizing that lasting security requires addressing root causes generating armed groups. Rural populations across the Sahel have suffered decades of government neglect with minimal state presence, few government services, no rule of law, and extraction of resources without development investment. This neglect created power vacuums that armed groups filled, providing services governments failed to deliver while extracting their own forms of taxation. We address governance deficits by establishing state presence in previously neglected areas, deploying administrators, judges, police, teachers, healthcare workers, demonstrating that government provides services and justice rather than merely demanding taxes and loyalty. Extreme poverty across Sahel rural areas creates desperation, enabling armed group recruitment. Young men facing unemployment, unable to afford marriage, excluded from economic opportunities naturally consider armed groups offering salaries, status, and purpose. We address economic marginalization through development programs providing alternatives, agricultural support increasing productivity, vocational training for trades, microcredit enabling small business creation, infrastructure connecting rural areas to markets, and direct employment in security forces and government services. Climate change has intensified competition over diminishing resources, particularly water and arable land. Conflicts between farmers and herders, between villages over land boundaries, between mining companies and local communities create grievances and violence that armed groups exploit. We address resource competition through mediation, establishing agreements on resource sharing, through development increasing resource availability, including water infrastructure and agricultural intensification, and through enforcement of negotiated agreements preventing resource conflicts from escalating into violence. Ethnic and religious minorities, marginalized groups, and populations excluded from political power feel government doesn't represent them, creating alienation that armed groups exploit. We address social exclusion through inclusive governance, ensuring that minority communities have representation, that government services reach all populations regardless of ethnicity or religion, and that security forces include diverse composition reflecting populations they protect. Absence of functioning justice systems means grievances go unaddressed, disputes escalate into violence, and populations distrust government. We address justice deficits by establishing courts and prosecutors in rural areas, by training judges in local conflict resolution traditions, by creating accessible mechanisms for populations to seek justice, and by demonstrating through prosecutions and compensation that justice is available. This holistic approach, addressing root causes rather than merely suppressing symptoms, produces sustainable security because it eliminates the grievances and conditions that armed groups exploit. When populations have functioning governance, economic opportunities, fair resource allocation, political inclusion, and access to justice, armed group recruitment becomes far more difficult, and armed group justifications for violence lose credibility. This is the model Nigeria should adopt rather than welcoming American cruise missiles and subordinating Nigerian security policy to American command. Build Nigerian security capabilities based on local knowledge, community relationships, and commitment to Nigerian populations rather than foreign corporate interests. Invest in intelligence and law enforcement, developing human intelligence networks that understand local dynamics rather than depending on American satellite and drone surveillance providing technical data without context. Address socioeconomic conditions, poverty, unemployment, marginalization, resource competition that enable criminal and extremist recruitment rather than merely conducting military operations targeting symptoms.